Good morning, everyone. My name is Himanshu Shekhar. A very warm welcome from the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security here in Bonn. We welcome all our guests, all our panelists, and people joining from across the globe, despite being in different time zones. In this webinar series, where we look at the adaptation futures and world risk trends, we have now come to what I would say the core academic or the core research part, where we look not just at the research side, but also its applicability in the policy making process. And I'm super excited to have a very esteemed panel with us today, who would help us navigate the tricky questions that help us in looking at the trends in climate change vulnerability, at the same time also at social protection. Our discussion would be more at the global scale, but at the same time, given our engagements and understanding of different parts of the world, we would also be popping up experiences and anecdotes from here and there. So this is going to be a very exciting session. And in the beginning, I request all of you to please note that you can definitely ask questions. There is a Q&A button, so please make use of that. If you would like to point your question to a particular panelist, you may do that as well. So we would start with two keynote presentations, and then we will go in the opening remarks from other panelists, and we would have time for some in-depth discussion on certain points as they arise along the course of webinar. And finally, we would start taking your questions. We also keep note of all the questions that come along in other webinars, and we always make sure that we design the subsequent one in a way that we build upon the learnings as well as the remaining questions from the previous ones. So with this, it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Dr. Coco Warner, who is going to be the moderator of this particular event. Some of you might already be familiar with Coco. Coco leads the Adaptation Knowledge and Vulnerability Program at United Nations Climate Change Secretariat here next door in Bonn. She is IPCC lead author on climate impacts. She has founded Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which is a support, one of the co-organizers for this year's Academy, along with UNFCCC, Munich Foundation, and LMU Munich. And Coco has been ranked as top 20 women in climate change debate. So Coco, thanks a lot for joining us. We are really privileged to have you, and thanks for your time. And I must say, very succinct moderation. We are extremely delighted to have with us Terry Kennan, a very renowned face in the debates regarding social protection and climate change. He is a senior fellow at Institute of Development Studies, IDS, at the University of Sussex. Many of us have read a lot of work from Terry. Definitely he needs no introduction, but just for the sake of it, his work focuses on significance of natural hazards and climate change as challenges to development. He teaches postgraduate course at IDS and many other universities, as well as the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Dhaka, Bangladesh. He has widely published academic and policy work on climate change and disasters, and he's co-author of a book that was one of the first books that was my introduction to this field, At Risk, Natural Hazards, People's Vulnerability and Disaster, that was published first in '94 and again in 2004. And his work has been cited in many languages. So Terry, it's an extreme pleasure to have you with us. Thanks a lot, and we very much look forward to your inputs. We are very happy to have with us Professor Matthias Garshagen, who, as you might be knowing, is also the academic dean of the program. Matthias holds the chair in human geography at LMU Munich, and he also holds an honorary position at RMIT University in Australia. Among many hats that Matthias wears, he is also lead author currently in IPCC's spatial report on ocean and cryosphere, as well as the 6th assessment report. For a number of years, he has been the scientific lead of World Risk Report, and he was, till a couple of years back, he was with us here at the United Nations University. Matthias, thanks a lot for joining us today, and we definitely look forward to your remarks. We are very excited to have with us Dania Cruz. She's a research officer at United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD. If I'm not wrong, Dania, you are based in Geneva, and where you lead UNIRSD's work on climate justice, which definitely is one of the core topics that has come again and again during this series of webinar, with a focus on just transition to low carbon development and transformative adaptation to climate change in coastal cities. Some, like many super important words already there. And you coordinate Just Transition Research Collaborative and co-edited recently a volume on just transition, social justice, and shift toward low carbon world. You are a geographer by training. You have worked previously with us at United Nations University, EHS here in Bonn, and UNEP. Thanks a lot for joining us today, and we look forward to your inputs. It's my extreme pleasure to introduce also Cecilia Costella. She is a senior technical research advisor at Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center, as well as a doctoral researcher at ITC, University of Twente in the Netherlands. She's a social protection expert working over a decade on the interlinkages between climate and disaster risk management. She has worked with all the leading multilateral agencies, be it World Bank, be it the World Food Program, and so on, where her work is mostly in the field of interlinkages between social protection and early action, climate change risk, and vulnerability. Your work has focused on Sub-Saharan Africa and recently on Southeast Asia. So thanks a lot. And I must also inform that you are currently working on integrating lessons from COVID-19 responses into social protection in Caribbean and Southeast Asia. So extremely useful topic there. And finally, it gives me a lot of happiness to introduce my next door neighbor who's just sitting behind this wall, Dominic Sett. He works with me here at United Nations University. Dominic is one of our emerging scientists here, and his work is around the aspect of interlinkages of social protection and climate disaster risk. And he has been associated with various projects in the past here at United Nations University. He's a project associate in the Adaptive Social Intervention Program in Indonesia. He holds a master's from the joint masters that United Nations University offers with the University of Bonn. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for joining us today. With this, I already have taken a lot of time. So without any further ado, maybe Matthias, we ask you to provide your keynote input, and then at the same time, Coco, now the chair is yours. The moderation chair is yours. I am going in the background. Thank you. Matthias, you want to start?
Yes. I was just waiting for you to stop sharing the screen so I can share mine. Okay, yeah. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I see from the list of participants, we still have a global reach, and we have many people linking in from different parts of the world. So hello to you all. It's a pleasure to be with you again here. What I have in mind today is to just talk a little bit in the beginning about three core questions. Social protection, what is it? Where do we stand? Secondly, with social protection coverage, and are some of the debates that we are having also conceptually currently, are they actually helpful in guiding our social protection thinking and action in the future? So in other words, I want to talk about trends in climate change, vulnerability, and social protection. That's the title also of today's sessions. What do we know on the global scale? Where do we need to know more? And what are different knowledge gaps? And where do we also maybe need different types of knowledge? That's, I think, questions that would be quite interesting for today's session. Social protection, what is it? Let's just quickly start. There's many definitions out there. I actually work a lot on Asia, so I have a definition here of the ADB, which I find quite useful because it already alludes to the links that we're interested in. It says basically social protection is a set of policies and programs designed to reduce poverty and vulnerability by promoting efficient labor markets, diminishing people's exposure to risks, and enhancing their capacity to protect themselves against hazards and interruption or loss of income. And so I think that's what we're talking about. And let's see where we actually stand in the global picture of doing this. Typically, social protection is being broken down into three parts. So we tend to think in the literature of social protection as social insurance and social assistance and labor market programs. I think today we'll be mostly talking about those two in the beginning, not so much about the labor programs, but let's see. What's the purpose of these three? I mean, where do they differ? Social insurance really is based on contributory schemes, so help people to respond to common risks such as illness, old age, or unemployment. And it's basically the measures that we know around health insurance, for instance, pension systems, passive labor markets. So people usually contributing to a scheme and then also having entitlement to get something out of the scheme. Social assistance might be quite different from that sometimes, because it provides unrequited transfers to groups such as the poor who cannot qualify for insurance or would receive inadequate benefits from such a source. So quite a different logic here. And I think it will be interesting in a minute to see where we stand in different profiles globally also. So you don't pay into a scheme, but you are still supposed to get something out, to get assistance if you are in situations of hardship. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong direction. Usually that are, for example, cash or in-kind transfers, child welfare, that can be disaster relief, can be a lot of things. And I think Cecilia and others will be talking about that. Just for completion, the active labor market programs help to promote secure employment, for instance, in situations like COVID. Do you immediately lose your job or will you stay connected? Obviously, that's also very important for the context we're talking about here, which is the vulnerability link in respect to natural hazards and climate change, because income is so important, and a livelihood, a functional livelihood and income in employment is so important for lots of other things in respect to your vulnerability. But still, we won't be focusing too heavily on those programs today. So just as a quick starter, what are we actually talking about when we talk about social protection? And maybe we need to understand particularly the difference between social insurance and social assistance when really talking about future trends, when talking about coverage worldwide and how effective it can be. So let's talk about that quickly. Social protection coverage. What do we know actually on the global scale? There has been a report once by the IDB, or a couple of times actually, where they differentiate social protection between the depth and the coverage of people. And what do they mean? They basically mean, in terms of coverage, which percentage of the people that are supposed to receive social protection actually also really perceiving it. And in terms of depth, how deep does it go? If you get something out, is it actually effective? Is it sufficient to actually really improve your situation, to get you out of poverty, for instance, to help you navigate a crisis? And that can take various metrics. Here we choose a metric that's something ongoing work currently for publication together with Dominic Zett. Also, we use the metric here where we basically say, let's take the average transfer amount as a percentage of GDP per capita. That should mean in purchasing power parity. Now let's just look into the global picture of what we find, and here split up into a couple of country groups, high income country groups, and then all the way down to the yellow to the low income country groups. And we see a quite interesting picture emerging if we just take a look into social protection as a combination of assistance and insurance measures. We see that actually there's a wide bandwidth in terms of the breadth that we see, but we also see that in lower income countries, typically we tend to have a lower breadth, so a lower coverage in terms of the percentage of people that are being covered. In terms of the depth, that actually appears to be very similar, but if we look into the disaggregated picture, which I'll show you in the next slide, between social insurance and social assistance, so you could say between measures where you pay in and then also you have an entitlement to something, versus maybe measures where you have assistance and you are more reliant on external forces, being the government, the external donors coming in and giving you something, then we see certain differences here. In terms of the social assistance breadth, we see a broader bandwidth, but we don't see as much as depth as we see in the social insurance that we have globally. But also in both pictures, again, we see quite a strong gradient here amongst income groups. So by and large, it tends to be the case that higher income countries on aggregated measures, I'll talk about disaggregated figures in a moment, but on aggregated measures across their societies, higher income countries tend to have a higher coverage in terms of the breadth, in terms of the social insurance, both assistance and insurance, which is maybe not surprising, but is alluding us to a problem, obviously, because we have a lot of very high vulnerability people in the global picture, more in the lower income countries. And so that speaks to some of the future considerations we want to discuss today. We then looked into the links between vulnerability specifically with respect to natural hazards and climate change impacts. And you can argue forth and back whether indicator-based numeric assessments are useful in that respect, but they are being used in the policy world. And so we compared here 3 of the leading indicators, indicator-based indices, I should say more precisely. You might know the word risk index, the inform index, and the ND gain index. And we took the vulnerability components in particular, so the predisposition to suffer harm when being exposed to a hazard, that will be the idea here. So the vulnerability and the susceptibility predispositions here. And we try to compare that to the social protection coverage that we have. And the picture that emerges is this. I just plot for you here the vulnerability on the left-hand side, the blue graphs, and the yellow graphs, the susceptibility. And we see, that's also not surprising to us, a strong relationship between both the depth and the breadth of social protection, so that in those countries where we have globally the highest vulnerability amongst the population, and these are typically measured in terms of Gini coefficient, for instance, or GDP, also coverage with healthcare systems, access to education, those things. And we see that in those countries where we have lots of higher vulnerability on aggregated country level metrics, we also see that the depth of social protection typically tends to be lower, and the breadth also. So we see a relationship there, which I think should inform us. Now let's look into some disaggregated data. And you could ask, well, the national averages actually are not so interesting, because I'm really interested in the most vulnerable people. And oftentimes these are, not always, but oftentimes these are also the poorer parts of a society. So let's take a look into whether or not actually the coverage with social protection is higher in the poorest quintile of populations. And we split again between low-income countries and then all the way to high-income countries. So this is data taken out of a recent World Bank report. I should say also the previous assessment is basically run on the Aspire data in the World Bank database. And this one here is using the similar data, but disaggregating it by poorest percentiles. And what you would guess is actually that, yes, hopefully, if social protection really works well and is oriented towards the most vulnerable, you see an overproportional coverage of the poorest quintile. In other words, the poorest people have a higher coverage in terms of social protection than the national averages. So that's what you would expect, and that's what we see roughly in the higher income countries. Interestingly, in the low income countries, if you look into formal social protection, we heard a lot about informal social protection also the other day. We were talking about formal social protection. You don't see that strong difference, actually almost the identical number. And this is, I think, going to be very important for us in the discussion. So in other words, the poorest segments don't get overproportional coverage by social protection, whereas you would think they would actually get priority in those programs in the low income countries. So we see on various levels of aggregation or at various scales, actually quite a troubling nexus of poor coverage with social protection, with high vulnerability, with low income on a national scale, and then even disaggregated in the income quintiles. We also see, and that's a similar picture here, the coverage of the poorest quintile again in percent. So which percentage of the poorest quintile is actually covered? And the transfer that is actually being taken as part of the total overall welfare of these people. And then the amount of people that's indicated by the size here of reduction in headcounts and poverty. And again, we see a picture that particularly in the lower income countries, the blue pictures here, and basically the percentage of those people that are being lifted out of poverty due to social protection is comparatively small. Also, the coverage is small. We already did this in the previous graph, but also does what they get actually help them to get out of poverty, which is oftentimes one of the predeterminants for high vulnerability. That is not as effective as in other countries. Also, just an interesting observation. We can come back to that in the discussion to discuss why that is, and particularly what needs to be done about it, maybe. So if we then think about extending social protection, we can think about two axes, basically. How do we increase the amount of population that gets it? And how do we increase the depth of the benefits that are going on? And both would be important. We can argue forth and back in a minute in the panel discussion of what is important for different contexts. If you really are hit down by a storm, for instance, by a strong typhoon, Terry Cannon will be talking about that. What amount do you need in order for your livelihood still not to go bankrupt or still not to go down? That's one percentage, but also one consideration, but also the question, who of the population should actually be covered? Now let's take a look, and here we can only have very indicative results of what actually is happening at the global level. Again, based on Aspire data, we did some assessment, and you could think about now a four-quadrant system here, where basically you have the breadth again on this axis and the depth on this axis, and then you have combinations of increase and decrease. Now, if I show to you the social assistance figure, we basically see that over the last years, and here we took the available time steps of roughly 100 countries over the last 20 years roughly, and looked into how has the picture changed in percentage changes, you see that a lot of countries have actually, when it comes to social assistance, invested into increasing the breadth here, with mixed signals and increasing the depth. That picture is also similar for social insurance, increasing the breadth, not so much actually increasing the depth. And in fact, in some cases, you're actually decreasing the depth also. So that is quite interesting. And the overall picture in social protection would then be that. So a lot of movement has actually been going into increasing the breadth, getting more people into coverage, but we should discuss later in the panel discussion, maybe in situations of limited resources, particularly in low-income countries, by spreading it thin towards the entire population or larger shares of the population, how deep can you possibly get in your coverage? And should the priority maybe be set differently? That's maybe something to discuss. I'll be closing off by just a couple of provocative considerations of whether or not current conceptual debates help us actually to move our debates and also our analysis in the right direction. And I would just be starting by an observation. If you think about risk and vulnerability, you had a long time a debate where also vulnerability thinking was originating from, and we really have one of the sort of godfathers of these writings with us today with Terry Cannon, where a lot of the debate was actually how much of the risk is driven by the environment, or is it actually not a social or a societal problem? Should we really think about natural disasters, or that it's not rather societal disasters? And that is all important, and we need to remember that. Why? Because nowadays our debate is oftentimes very much concerned, for good reasons, don't get me wrong, about the question, what can we do about it? How do we get out of the risky and vulnerable situations? And their strong considerations now seem to be what is actually the right distribution between state and shared responsibility, between individual responsibility. I'm not doing it here, but I could show you some quite troubling empirical results that basically show that in a lot of countries, basically we're moving into more of an individual responsibility. In other words, the social contract in a society to be ready to actually invest into risk sharing, into risk transfer is, I would argue, diminishing in many parts of the world. At least it's not increasing in the same pace as we would need it to be with increasing risks. And that is important for us to consider. It's more of these underlying questions that I think we should come back to. A last provocation then is actually the current debate. And so you could say here, a lot of this debate is actually around adaptation and resilience, where a lot of this debate was actually about production of vulnerability and production of risk. And I would be arguing that with the resilience debate, it's useful for some parts, but it's also very ambiguous. And actually, there have been debates in the literature that say, is that not all a very neoliberal exercise, where basically the narrative is often reduced to the system is broken, we all need to be resilient, we are all in this together, so everybody needs to bear its own share of burden, which can be a quite sarcastic argument if in the previous years we've actually been reducing social protection networks, for instance, forcing people into vulnerable situations and now telling them all of us need to be part of the solution to get out. These are some of the troubles we have with current debates, I would be arguing, and also quite depoliticized debate about resilience, which is often oriented around averages in systems. Does the system survive? Do you have a resilient coupled social ecological system or whatsoever? And then the argument is it needs to be answered along key functions. Do you maintain key functions in the system? But who actually gets to decide what a key function is and for whom? And you would be surprised how different these answers are if you ask different people in a society. So happy to come back to that argument. And we've been arguing lately with a colleague from the UK, also Mark Pelling, that hence we need to focus much stronger again in our thinking, in our writing, in our analysis, not on averages across systems, but actually let's go back to have a yardstick among who are the most vulnerable and do they actually benefit from something like social protection, for instance. And I think some of the recent trends I showed you earlier in the presentation are quite troubling in that respect and are not delivering to the full yardstick of let's really focus on the most vulnerable. Conclusions will all come in the panel discussion, hopefully, and I'll shut up here. Back to you, Coco.
Wow, thank you so much, Matthias. That was incredible. I loved your almost Hans Rosling approach and so factful, incredibly insightful. I was also watching the chat box as you were speaking. Lots of panelists are interested in your data. Also troubling where you ended. You know, last year, as all of you know, Summer Academy is a series. And our topic last year was demography and trends and all in demography. And I remember one of the presentations was about water and health, and some of the greatest achievements in the 20th century when it comes to longevity, how long we live, how well we live, they came in relation to investments in public goods like water and clean water. And what you just basically ended with, Matthias, is risk is definitely rising, but our commitment to managing this risk collectively seems to be a contested space. That's really interesting, troubling, and gives us a lot of food for thought. And now we're going to go over to our second keynote speaker, Terry Cannon. Your reputation precedes you. It's so good to see you, Terry. Terry's been a long time contributor to the Academy. And Terry, your work on vulnerability, yeah, we know it, and we're just so curious to hear your insights about some trends that you're seeing in the world, and share with us your thoughts. Over to you, Terry. Thank you, Matthias.
Thank you very much, and very nice to be here with you all. I have about 20 minutes. I hope to finish before 20 minutes so we can catch up a bit of time. I'm going to be quite provocative as well, I suppose. And my first thought is to say, why on earth is social protection necessary? So what is it that goes on in the world that requires these transfers of funds, either from governments to their people or in terms of international transfers through aid programs? Why are they needed? And to question some of the assumptions that come under this. So, but I think we also need to have quite a lot of clarity about issues. And so a lot of what I'm doing is going to be about trying to share ideas of improving clarity of critical thinking on some of these issues. So I'm going to start sharing my slides, if I can find it here. So this is just kind of a title which cooks up the linkages. So a lot of this is about the linkages between the different aspects of it. I'm going to start off with a very simple framework that we use a lot in my teaching. We have to be clear to what are people adapting. In other words, if social protection is useful, why is it useful for what people have to adapt to? And I think it's really, really important to understand that global warming is producing climate change in different ways. And if we're talking about arguing about the need for social protection, we need to understand to which kind of climate change might they be useful. And so, of course, many people in the audience for here are interested in hazards, the extreme events that relate to climate, cyclones, floods, and so on. And so this is designated with the letter H. But although many outsiders look at climate change as if it is the main worry is the extreme events, we should all be very, very clear that it is not only the extreme events. Climate change itself is driven by the trend of temperature rising, and the trends of temperature and rainfall increasing in much of the world is what we may need to be worried about rather than hazards, because this is having a powerful effect on crop production, livestock, and disease, and the spread of diseases to new areas. So we really need to look at that. But I think actually the real killer of climate change does not get very much coverage, and that's increased variability. It's the fact that the vast majority of poor people in the world in rural areas are climate dependent, and their climate dependency includes having access to a climate which is relatively predictable. But with increased variability of climate, I think this is the real killer. If the rainfall does not come when expected or comes in irregular patterns with rapid changes or changes in temperature, I think this is more powerful as an effect on people and their livelihoods than hazards. Now, some of you will already have spotted where this is going with the increased, with the initial letters, because climate change is shit. And so the fourth component of the climate change is the slow onset one, sea level rise, glacier melt, and so on, and potential disruptions of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. Now, this wonderful mnemonic, I credit to one of our students who came up with it when I didn't have this, this way of remembering it. And I said, it's really hard to remember, but really important. You understand there are 4 different kinds of impacts of climate change. And she came back the next week and said, Terry, it's shit. And so we have this, which feel free to share, because I think it's a very powerful way of remembering. Now, the other thing to remember is the attribution problem, because in the hazards, all of these are natural processes until climate change kicks in. As it kicks in, of course, it has much more frequency or intensity of these hazards. And we cannot blame climate change for there being cyclones or floods. Those are normal. And what we're finding is that there's a lack of clarity over what amount of a particular hazard is related to and generated by climate change. I now want to move to a different framework in which we build up the idea of vulnerability. So this is a framework for analyzing vulnerability that I've used for a few years. It's quite complex, and I won't be able to go into too much detail. So I'm adding some slides which will be shared, which are reference slides. I'm going to start, this is a people-centered approach. So let's start with people and their livelihoods. Now, Matthias has already covered a lot of the issues of the bottom quintile of population and so on, and whether or not they are targeted. Let's start off here with livelihoods which are inadequate. They're not strong enough and they're not resilient to particular hazards. And so they give rise to a baseline well-being which is inadequate. So there is not a good link between here. There's a disconnect between having an adequate livelihood and it giving you adequate food, nutrition, and health, and so on. So this is one of the areas within which some of the social protection issues that have been mentioned, they are to help make this connection better, to improve this. Now, the key question there is, why is it necessary? What is going on in livelihoods, which means that people need social protection or any kind of additional assistance? So I really want us to think deeply about that. What is that disconnect coming from? The other important point about the livelihood is it gives you the ability to self-protect against climate change or known hazards. So you can use your income and resources, if you have enough of it, to have a safe house in a safe location and avoid some of the hazards that may be thrown at you. Now, of course, this is derived on how good your livelihood is. Is it bringing enough money? But we also have another problem, that people don't spend money on safety. And a lot of my work in recent years has been looking at the kind of cultural and priority issues where people do not give the hazards, the extreme events, adequate priority. Now, this is another area where social protection comes in, because outside agencies come in with a form of social protection for hazards which replaces the inability or unwillingness of people to protect themselves. So this is a key area in which social protection interacts with the vulnerability framework. Now, the next point, which is really important to understand, you may not be able to see it on your screen, but the top word is governance or systems of power. Now, these are, of course, crucial to everything we need to understand. And it's these systems of power that determine how good social protection is, and also linking up to the bottom, whether or not you get enough livelihood assets to have a decent livelihood. So, for example, the governance system in South Asia allocates land unfairly to a small proportion of people who have a lot of land, to many millions who have a little bit of land, and to many, many, many millions who have no land at all. And this connects up with social protection, because many of you will know the NREGA system in India for providing guaranteed employment for 100 days a year, which is a system of social protection, which precisely is there because there are hundreds of millions of people who have no land or very little land, who are then supposedly helped by the government, the NREGA system of income support. But the also on the right-hand side, the key disconnect too there is that bad governance leads to poor social protection. So in relation to hazards, one form of social protection is warning systems. Now, I know that much of what we talked about already is around cash and cash transfers and so on. But I think we should also understand that social protection in relation to hazards is about whether you get adequate coverage for prevention and precaution and warnings. So, for example, there are many countries in the world that do not have cyclone warning systems. There are many countries in the world that do not implement building codes so that buildings are safe in storms and especially in earthquakes. So these are key connections that link us up with connections as well. Now, I want to say something which might seem slightly obvious, but I think we actually have to look at the obvious. The world is the way it is because those who have power want it to be that way. The world is the way it is because those who are running the world from macro level down to micro level in villages, they like it like that. So everything that we're trying to do, we as outsiders who are thinking about these things and acting in relation to aid or adaptation, we're actually usually working against people who don't want to change it. So what is going on that needs change? Why does the system require there to be social protection? What is going on in the normal system that requires that to happen? So when we try to support poor and vulnerable people to have something different and better, what we're doing is actually pushing against those who run the world from micro up to macro level who don't want to change it. I think that's a really very simplistic statement, but really one that we need to be thinking about. So we hope that social protection is one of the methods, and sometimes it's supported by some governments and by donor funding. Social protection is one of the measures to push against the world as it is towards what we think it ought to be in order for social justice to happen. But underlying that, we ought to be thinking, well, why does it not happen anyway? Why do labor markets need to be interfered with to produce a better outcome for people? So that's really quite important to understand. And underlying that is also another fundamental question relating to climate change. Which countries have a political economic system that is conducive to coping with, adapting to climate change? I think there are very few. I think there are very few countries in which the existing system of power as it operates is actually capable of dealing with climate change or even wants to deal with climate change. So we shouldn't ignore this. We should actually accept and push our thoughts around this. It's really quite important that we do. And how should it best be arranged to deal with this inadequacy? Because clearly, if these political economic systems in many countries continue the way they are, and I'm not talking about emissions, I'm not talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I'm talking about creating a society in which people can cope with global warming. That's what I'm talking about, not emissions. This is adaptation issues. So how is adaptive social protection a way of effectively dealing with that? And what additional resources might be needed for climate change in addition to normal, what we might call normal social protection? So this is the gap, if you like, between what's happening now and what might be needed. And where should the money come from if it is money that is needed? And if that money comes, should it be loans? Because there's an ethical question here around the idea that poorer countries and poorer people in poorer countries are recipients of loans, which the country has to pay back for the damage done by the rich countries in creating global warming. And there's a lot of interest in those who have finance to issue these as loans rather than grants. And as you all are aware, I'm sure, the allocation of funds which was in the Paris Agreement, which is supposedly $100 billion a year being transferred, very little of that is earmarked for adaptation, and we'll come back to that in a minute, and the problem of loans. So underlying all this, I think it's really vital to understand and acknowledge that power determines access, to assets and income of most of the people in the world. The most of the people in the world are recipients of policies which determine how they live. They are existing within political economic systems over which they have very little control, which determines how well they live. So the first one is, of course, these systems allocate production assets. So if land or water is accessible unequally to different people, that is because the system of power that allocates those resources in those ways. Income is distributed unequally, and in many cases because there is a lack of redistributive taxation or a failure even to collect taxation, which would then be usable for welfare or redistributive purposes. Where taxation is collected, it is in some countries used for what we used to call the social wage, that is education and health services. Now, if you receive these free through the government, then you don't need such a high wage, which is why it's called the social wage. If you have to pay for these services, then you have to have an adequate income from your livelihood. So again, we're relating here to social protection because in some cases, education is supported by social protection measures. Then there is what we call welfare or universal benefits. These are things which in some countries are available to all people as a right of welfare provision. Governments under neoliberalism have pushed down on all of these, on the services and on welfare provision, and some countries don't have them at all. There are many countries which have no pension system, no unemployment benefits, and again, social protection has come in here, for example, in relation to trying to support pensions and so on. Then we have social protection as it's been traditionally, which is targeted benefits of the kind that Matthias was looking at. Cash grants and NREGA, which I've mentioned already as an employment guarantee, income support, targeted benefits for encouraging school attendance, and so on. But then we also have, I think we have to add this, social protection related specifically for DRR to hazards. And these include, of course, things which are structural, like building codes, land use zoning, and so on. But here is also where we begin to see things which are forms of social protection which link up with climate change. So we have crop insurance and the Red Cross forecast-based finance systems and others here. So here I'm trying to integrate our understanding of social protection with these other things here, which traditionally here are regarded as being under DRR. So how do we integrate these to understand them better? So I now want to introduce the concept of, just very quickly, this is traditional social protection. We need now to think about how we integrate it with hazard social protection. We also know that some exist with external funding. The gray boxes are where there is external funding. So sometimes in the recent past, DFID has supported the health ministry in Uganda, for example, its budgetary support to those services. Cash grants here, of course, are getting external funding. And down here, these are externally funded. So we need to understand where in this is external or internal funding being used. Now I want to introduce the concept of the adaptation gap. If you can't see it at the top, that's what it says, the adaptation gap. How relevant is it to understanding adaptive social protection? I define the adaptation gap as this. Now, there's no time to read it. It's my own definition. You can critique it if you like, but what the key part of it is the gap between what you've got now and what you might need to deal with climate change. Now, the gap can be for any kind of entity at all. So it can be for a health clinic. What is the gap between what that health clinic budget is now and what it might need to deal with increased dengue or malaria or in worsening mental health issues and so on. But also I want to say that it may not be only money that's needed. It may need to be changing the way society is structured. And this is a diagram which tries to illustrate this, and it also illustrates the relationship between the H, I, and T of the SHIT framework. So this is rising average trend in rainfall. Let's take this as climate change has kicked in. These orange, this orange line is the annual figures. And you can see that this dashed line here is the available resources that are possible for a particular entity. Let's call it a low income low livelihood household, they have an envelope of capacity to deal with rising rainfall trend, except here there are floods, which they can't deal with, or excess rainfall. And here, these red rings are inadequate rainfall, drought, if you like. So this is the trend of the T of the SHIT framework. This is the increased variability because it's getting more. And this is the increased hazards, where these hazards are poking through the comfort zone, the envelope of coping that the people have. So what we need for the adaptation gap is to create a new envelope which is wider. Ideally, it should rise with global warming and rainfall increase as well. So this is the adaptation gap, is the gap between what you've got already, the black dashed line, and the red line, which would enable you to cope with and adapt to global warming, to climate change in this sense. So where does that gap come? How is that gap dealt with? And is social protection measures, are they part of the way in which this is done? Now, I'm going to finish off with some broader thinking about what is needed to fill this gap. And then we need to think about what is the role or not of social protection in doing that. So let's look at how this gap might be filled by adaptation funding. So this is a very rough calculation of adaptation needs in financial terms, assuming that it's finance that is helpful. And I'm taking as my baseline a project which is going on, a World Bank project in Malawi, which is called a watershed project. I don't have time to go into it. The reason I'm using it is because we can get a figure for what this project claims might be necessary to adapt to dealing with floods and global increase in rainfall. Local increase in rainfall. So it's about management of the watersheds. There are supposedly 250,000 beneficiaries. If you divide the total funding for this, and I'm leaving aside the fact that an awful lot of that funding will go to external consultants, if you divide those beneficiaries into the total funding for this project, it's around $500 per head. Now, going back to Matthias's figures for the bottom quintile and so on, I'm not using the same figures, but that's the kind of thing I want you to be thinking of. The global rural population, which is in the front line of climate change, we could say is about half of the total global population. And of them, let's assume that 30% of them need adaptation support. In other words, at the, and of course this is just a guess, but let's assume that they are poor enough or will become poor because of global warming that they need support. And that's 1 billion people, okay? So if we multiply the 500 per head for a very basic adaptation project by that 1 billion people, it comes to a figure of around $500 billion, okay? And we also need to understand, is that per year? How long will the benefits of the watershed project last? Adaptation needs to be looking ahead to 5 years, 15 years, or even 30 years ahead. So over what scale is adaptation being supported, and what will social protection do to support that? Adaptive social protection, what is the time scale that is looking at? Now this is what you could say is a very simplistic way of looking at the demand for things which might include social protection measures. Now let's look at the supply. So this is a summary of climate finance for the latest figures I could find. The total transfer of funds for climate finance, $71 billion. This is OECD collected data. Of this, only 19% was going to adaptation, because as we all know, far more money goes to mitigation, because this is where corporations, the private sector, can aim to make profit out of it. They may be supported by subsidies, but basically a lot of this mitigation money is in the commercial sector and is not really transfers of grants or even loans. So we've got tiny amount of money going on adaptation. Compare that with what I gave in the previous figure of 500 million. Now, of this money, of all of it, about 2/3 is public. In other words, it's bilateral and multilateral aid going from governments to directly to governments or to the World Bank or Asian Development Bank and so on. Of the multilateral funding, 90% is loans. You remember my comment earlier on. What we have is a situation where loans are being allocated to poor countries to undo the damage that is being caused by rich countries in dealing with climate change. Is that ethical? Is that something which we should be supporting? And we come back to the point here that the world is the way it is because those who have power want it to be this way. And I think these figures show that we have an enormous adaptation gap, enormous concern about what can and cannot be achieved with adaptation social protection. So I'll stop there. When you see the slides, you'll see that there are quite a few extra reference slides, which I'm quite happy to take questions through email if anyone wants to look at them or challenge or comment on anything I've said, because of course it's a big topic to cover in 20 minutes. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to
Thanks so much, Terry.
Coco. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Super provocative. And one could hardly wish for a better opening set of keynotes. Both you and Matthias have given us a fact base. You've provided some really some insights that I think, at least for me, have really pushed our boundaries. One question I do have for you, Terry, and maybe we can get to it when we have a chance to talk with the other discussants who are coming next, is power is almost a characteristic of the system. And so I'll be curious when we get a chance to talk with you and dig in a little bit deeper. You know, if power is almost like your independent variable, isn't it an independent variable or an endogenous variable that represents the whole system? And how could you get levers if you were going to change that? We're definitely, and this circles back to Matthias, we're in a world with changing risks, maybe increasing risks. And people are going to benefit if they have some solid ground under their feet. How do we do that? It almost seems, these aren't the words that you use, Terry, but we were talking a lot about the system is the way it is because there may be gatekeepers or people who are in power, elites, that it suits them, that system serves them. So how could we get the changes that are needed to make sure that people who are right on the front lines of these risks don't fall below, like that graph that you were showing? You probably have tons of thoughts about that. And I just found that super provocative. Okay, but there's more, and some comments and questions are already now coming into the chat box. Now we have a chance to have some very brief opening statements, maybe even reflections on what they've heard from Terry and Matthias. We're going to start with Cecilia, and then Dunya, and then Dominique. So we have 3 discussants or additional panelists. And then the great thing after that is that we'll all be able to talk together. So for all of you who are tuning in, listening via social media or here on Zoom, make sure and use that chat function, and that will really enrich our discussion. So Cecilia, what are some reflections now that we've had this really energetic start? And thanks again, Terry and Matthias. Over to you, Cecilia.
Yes, thanks a lot, Coco, and thanks everyone for having me here. And I have the challenge to follow Matthias and Terry's presentation, but I'll try to reflect on this from the position, from sort of looking at it through the lens of social protection. I've been working on social protection for several years now, and always sort of trying to see the intersection with climate and disaster risk management. And so I'm sure that many people here today are familiar with, you know, there's been a set of sort of frameworks developed for social protection to deal with climate-related risks or disaster risks. And so we have frameworks like the Adaptive Social Protection Framework and the Shock Response to Social Protection Framework, Climate Response. But in spite of, you know, sort of this conversation going on for the last 10 years, we haven't really seen a lot of evidence of uptake of climate-related objectives into social protection programs. And honestly, we also haven't seen a lot of evidence on the outcomes of these programs for addressing climate-related vulnerabilities. So one would hope on the program level that the reason that we don't really see this uptake or this programs fully integrating climate-related objectives is because there is a smooth integration and everything is happening. But of course, we know by looking at sort of existing databases of social protection programs, looking at the literature that exists and the evidence that that the whole idea of adaptive or shock responsive social protection is not really being implemented in practice that much. And in many cases, I think, also to join my colleagues and be a bit provocative, in many cases, there is sort of a relabeling of same objectives to call them climate responsive or climate sensitive, but there hasn't really been a change to the program. In terms of outcomes, I think that there is some relatively solid evidence that social protection, especially social assistance programs, help vulnerable and poor households deal with the impacts of climate-related shocks. So essentially transferring some relatively small amounts of money or some other type of interventions after a shock has happened. And that's also something that we've been exploring with this idea of forecast-based financing that Terry was referring to. Essentially, if we know that people are protected by providing a small transfer, after a shock, we also know that acting earlier and, adding a set of preparedness measures to that is actually more efficient. So what about anticipating early action based on the climate information tools that we have, so that we can even deliver those social protection benefits earlier? But this is all, again, limited practice and relatively limited evidence, although the initial evidence we have shows that this type of grants actually help people improve things like access to food, and especially one interesting finding is, reduce stress during and after the disaster period and things like that. But so that all looks relatively strong. But when we look at sort of the evidence for social protection to reduce vulnerability in the longer term, to sort of have a sustained impact in time, from a climate adaptation perspective, we know that there is, very, very thin evidence. We know in general some social protection interventions have helped people improve food security and increase school enrollment and attendance, and in some cases investments in agricultural assets and things like that, which we think is associated with, reducing vulnerability, some of which could be climate related. But in general, we don't know how people experience climate vulnerability, what it means sort of for people in the future, what climate change may bring about, and what social protection has so far done to address any of those vulnerabilities. And of course, there is this idea as well that social protection should be transformational, in the sense that should empower people to be able to take care of themselves. But again, we don't have a lot of evidence, especially in terms of sort of the climate change adaptation. I think one interesting thought is that some people argue that this is too big of a role for social protection, and that maybe we're asking too much of it, right? And this touches upon some of the points that Matthias and Terry were making. The benefits that social protection delivers, or social assistance programs in general, they tend to be very small, and you can't expect that those benefits will have a transformational or even an adaptive outcome when the depth of those benefits is really, really insignificant to be able to make that transformation. And I think some other people have also said, well, we also have to be careful because some of the social protection interventions that we might be putting in place today might also be increasing risks in the future, right? By incentivizing people to possibly take up on activities that are detrimental to the climate or to the environment, but also in many places, perhaps by encouraging them to remain in livelihoods or in the type of employment that doesn't really, that is close to the limits of adaptation in that particular place. And then one final thought on the evidence is that in general, we also only have evidence about programs, right? We look at specific programs and we look at the outcomes, and it's, we don't find that much, but also we haven't really looked at systems. And when we think of social protection in more developed contexts, they tend to, the different programs and benefits tend to act as a system. So that's another important point. But so why hasn't happened? I think, there are many reasons, and I'm not going to touch on all of them. But I just wanted to touch on one possible reason, which I think connects to what we heard from the keynote speakers. And some people have argued that in general, that there could be a disconnect between the type of risk that we're trying and vulnerabilities that we're trying to address, when it comes to climate change and to climate risk, and the type of interventions that are supported by social assistance or social protection. So, for instance, when it comes to shock response, we've done some studies that look at sort of the overlap between the targeting of the social protection program and the people that are actually affected by a particular shock, and there isn't always an overlap. Sometimes, a particular group might be affected by a drought because they have access to land, because they have assets, and then the way in which the most vulnerable, the destitute that are covered by social protection, are affected is completely different. And we're not really tailoring interventions to meet those needs. But I think more importantly, in the long term, we're not really thinking about what climate change might bring about in terms of increased vulnerabilities, and designing social protection systems and intervention that take into account that future, that risk. In general, if we look at social protection, is sort of based on this idea of the last century, where social protection became a very relevant instrument to deal with income and labor-related shocks in the Western world. It's sort of something that came out of the industrialized economies in the West, but we haven't probably thought hard enough about what it means for social protection to be transformative in the 21st century. Yeah. So I think my sort of last reflection will be, if we want to sort of consider the transformational role of social protection, I think there is an example, again, in the historic role of social protection. So looking at, how social protection was an instrument for transforming social relationships
that we've seen in the past,
in the past, in the Western world, it definitely, we have seen that it has that power, but it has to be first transformed to deal with the risks that we face. And I think part of that is focusing beyond, just helping households, but also sort of focusing on that role of social protection as a way to transform societies.
And you're thinking, again, that system, that's really so interesting, Cecilia. We really appreciate your perspective from the IFRC, if I got that right, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Super, thank you so much. Dunya, we're going to go over to you kind of briefly. Sorry, everyone, this is just so much to talk about today. We can barely hold our horses. We're running just a little bit behind time. So Dunya and Dominique, we're just going to touch all too short on your insights, and then we'll broaden out where all of you as panelists can talk to each other, and then we'll also have you addressing some of the questions that are popping up in the Q&A. Dunya? And thanks, Cecilia. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Coco, and also previous panelists. It's true, there's so many issues I could touch upon. I will try and be short, and I'll try and start with kind of making just 3 main points from the perspective of UNREST, so the UN Research Institute for Social Development, as a reply to Matthias and Terry. So starting with the question, why is social protection even necessary? I think the initial response for me would be like, well, you can make all the plans and then life happens, right? Everybody might actually need social protection at one point in life. But also for us at UNREST, social protection is clearly something that is part of the social contract. So as a society, we've signed up to an agenda that recognizes the right to social security in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And of course, it's also reflected in the 2030 Agenda and other international agreements that countries have signed up to. But having said that, I just want to share briefly one image that we kind of have produced in our last flagship report to show a little bit where we are coming from at UNREST, because for us, it's really important to note that social protection is one of the key functions of social policy, but in order to come to transformative social policy, we need to look at social protection alongside issues of production, redistribution, and social reproduction. So it's kind of one element in a broader social policy framework that need to look at kind of the macroeconomic issues, etc. So we come at this from this normative point of view, but we do also have the evidence that social protection, social policies have an instrumental value because they do, for example, contribute to capital accumulation through kind of forced savings and social insurance funds, or they do directly contribute to human capital through ensuring health and education that will then also be reflected in employment and productivity of a nation. And a multiple of other things that I'm going to leave out. So the second point, I think that links quite directly to what Terry said, social protection, social policy is pretty directly reflective of the broader political economy. So I agree, we cannot look at it without looking at questions of power and also kind of looking at the longer term trends, because while we've seen in many developing countries kind of an increase in the expansion of social protection in the 60s and 70s, the debt crisis and the Washington Consensus and the neoliberal policy packages that followed led quite directly to reduced public spending, austerity policies, and that then also kind of really limited the space that those countries had in developing policies that were more universal. There was then the increased commercialization, introduction of kind of quite liberal private sector approaches, safety net here and there, kind of ideas of cash transfer programs, etc., but a dialing down of the kind of broader universal social policy. And I think it's important to recognize the role of the international system in this and how that kind of influences policy space at the national level. We did then, in the later 2000s, see quite a lot of effort also from the ILO colleagues in expanding social protection again, and the ILO recommendation for social protection floors, I think, is a really important initiative to take note of, because they really put forward this idea of each state should provide a social protection floor to their citizens that would cover minimum income security over the life course and health as well. So that will just kind of have a better, kind of more transformative impact on people than the individual kind of safety nets that we've seen. So bringing all of this is my third point now, bringing this back to the whole question of climate change vulnerability. I think, again, it's important to make the distinction, what Matthias was talking to already, between the kind of hazard-dependent vulnerability and the hazard-independent. So, of course, we have all the exposure-related issues that the SHIT framework also identified, but we have vulnerability as such. We do have poverty, we do have susceptibility, and I think actually the definitions are relatively interlinked. If you think about how we define vulnerability, what the aspects are in vulnerability that we consider, those are all areas that social protection can directly talk to and address if implemented well. So I think for me, I actually I do agree with Matthias' assessment on the issue of breadth and depth of coverage. There's still a long way to go. I do come to a bit of a different conclusion in terms of targeting, because for me, targeting cannot be the solutions. Based on our previous work, we've seen targeting in poor countries doesn't really make sense, because if you have situations of widespread poverty, targeting is quite unnecessary and administratively very costly. So it's we all know it's not trivial at all how you define vulnerability to identify who is actually vulnerable and who needs support. So there I would be in favor of actually really promoting the universal social protection framework, ensuring social protection for all, and then on top of that, add the hazard-dependent safety nets and kind of adaptive social protection mechanism that can respond more to the hazards and the variability. I'll stop there because of time. I do have a couple of other things.
It's so hard to, I can see, Donia, that you have a lot of additional thoughts just because I can see your screen and there's so much more to talk about. What I really love about what I'm hearing from you is, I don't want to say more practical, but you are trying to thread the needle on very practical issues. How do you identify what could a structure of a social protection program look like that is, it almost picks up where Cecilia left off, that really addresses the challenges of the 21st century. And super, super interesting. We'll come back to that. And this is the beginning of a conversation. Clearly, we have so much more to talk about. Dom, I'm going to come over to you. And you have the unfortunate, difficult job of both sharing your ideas and kicking off a wider panel discussion. So Dom, I'm going to do the same thing with you. If you could just, share some of your high-level thoughts. And then when you see me put my microphone on again, then I'm going to start bringing in everyone. We'll have the last, we have about 15 minutes to go. For those of you who can stay with us, we might extend just 5 minutes. It's a great conversation and we'll keep going. Don, what have you heard so far and where has it given you pause for thoughts?
Thanks so much, Coco, and also, of course, to Matthias and Terry and the other panelists, I think, for the brilliant inputs. I was actually preparing some slides that I don't really show because of time, I guess, but just to stress a very important point. I mean, we talked a lot about past trends, we talked a lot about evidence and data, and I think it's really important to actually take a step back and then see how much can we actually trust the data that we have at hand. Because sometimes you see data that shows a coverage of 80% maybe of the population, but then I think it's very important to also look into the data and see, okay, what is the coverage actually measuring? And Matthias presented some of the data from the Aspire World Bank database, and there it's actually coverage is defined in terms of household level. So whenever one person in a household receives some kind of benefits, the whole household is considered as beneficiary, so to say. I think this is providing some kind of implications for interpretation, because then it definitely comes then more towards the importance of the death component that we have. So not only looking at who is covered and maybe aiming for universal coverage, because again, this might also, based on the definition that you have, might be different or difficult actually, but then really looking into how and what is actually provided in terms of benefits that are out there. I think there are some good approaches on that. I mean, the SPI, the social protection indicator from the ADB, I would say is a really good indicator, which provided also was not only looking into the data that was provided by governments, but also sent out some consultants that were questioning some of the data that they found. I feel now with the social protection, with the SDG database, it's also one step forward in terms of data quality. However, in terms of data availability, there we also see that from around 200 countries that should be covered, only around 100 are covered. So basically, right now, we only know about 50% of the countries where they stand in terms of coverage. And this is not including the benefit that I just explained. Already 5 years after the the start of the SDGs, I think this is also quite crucial to see that how can you provide a social protection for all when you don't even have data for all 5 years after this agreement. And maybe then also to conclude and maybe also based on what Terry was mentioning quite beautifully in his presentation, the need to maybe look or go from a qualitative analysis to a more qualitative analysis. So not really looking how many percentages of the population is covered. And this also goes back to the point Matthias raised about not looking at averages, but really looking at, okay, who is really in need of social protection? And there I also see some kind of transformation. I mean, we talked about past trends and well, emergence of adaptive social protection within the last years. I think it's a very good example. Of course, as mentioned, there were also different definitions of that and different well, approaches how you define it. But I guess there is really good opportunity to transform growth-based and also poverty reduction focus of social protection and have it in a more rights-based and also well-being focus. So not only looking at poverty reduction and income level, but also looking at vulnerabilities and especially also well-being, which is then of course also a broader definition, definitely. And yeah, I guess in order to allow also a bit time for discussion, I stop here, although this would of course be continue for hours.
I totally wish we were in the old world where we could have lunch together or whatever. But John, that was fantastic. Since you referred to Terry's presentation, I'd love it. And of course, for our panelists, if you'd like to turn on your cameras, let's pretend that we're together. We can actually, at least we can see each other. Dawn, you mentioned Terry's presentation in particular. Could I have a mini conversation between the two of you? And also, Terry, I see a couple of questions coming to you through the chat as well as the Q&A. What do you think it would take to shift the system? Dom, you've provided us, as has Matthias, some really interesting numbers to think about. Terry, instead of thinking about the vulnerable people, well, it's not that you're not, but you actually kind of shifted the focus in the years that I have to, you know, do we know what those who have the system set up the way that serves them well, what do we know about them? What reflections do both of you have? It's a terrible question. I have been very vague. Could you reflect, discuss?
Okay.
Sorry, I just threw you into the deep water.
So I think we need to look at why, if we're serious about power analysis, and I've mentioned it, and of course there isn't one system of power in the world. There are multiple interlinking and nested systems of power going down to the village in Bangladesh, where it might be a local politician or the landlord who has significant dominance over the daily lives of people, right up to the US and China projecting their power globally, and corporations and billionaires and so on. So these, and then we have what you might call cultural systems of power that relate to gender and ethnicity, racism, and so on. And these operate in many different levels. And these are extremely difficult to change. So I think one thing that we don't do enough is actually look at the past 200 years, say, see, where and how did real transformations actually happen? So why don't we learn from that? And in the 20th century, we also see that the most significant and powerful things that changed people's lives for the better in many countries were the arrival of the welfare state, which was a product of a form of class struggle. It was the arrival of political parties in mostly in Western countries, which represented workers and represented the working class. And they were able to push politically, mostly through democratic means, the arrival of the welfare state. A lot of what we've talked about in social protection used to be called the welfare state in Western Europe. It's all under attack. So this was social movements led by the grassroots, which produced fundamental changes in how power operated. And that fundamental change, for example, in Britain, was from a society in the 19th century where you had private capitalist ownership of corporations and companies, which had very little interest whatsoever in the welfare of their workers, through pressure on things like child labor, laws on how old you had to be, compulsory schooling, and then housing, social housing, and then unemployment benefit, and so on. Parallel to that, we had social movements against gender discrimination on one main issue, which was the vote. But I think we shouldn't be too complacent. It took more than 100 years for women to get the vote in Britain. More than 100 years. How can our projects in developing countries hope to change the situation of gender in a 5-year project, which is what many claim? You know, every project that you get has a conditionality that it's going to deal with gender and empower women. How does that happen in a 3-year project? It took 100 years. We still don't have equity between males and females in the West. The pay gap in Britain is still very, very substantial. So I think we have to have an idea. We actually have to understand how transformation happens and not pretend that we do it through a 3-year project.
Again, provocative. Thank you. You know, some of the things that Terry was just mentioning reminded me that, Cecilia, I saw you nodding to a couple of things that Terry was just saying. Dom, you look very thoughtful, as is Matthias. And Dunya, you had actually mentioned universal basic income in your presentation. Cecilia and Dunya, what are your reflections? Listening to what Terry was just saying about really understanding the structure of transformation. What would that mean? I mean, Cecilia, you're in IFRC. Dunya, you were talking about new directions for social protection. I'm curious about your reflections.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first because this is a topic that is very close to my heart. But I completely agree, and with what Terry was saying, I think two reflections. One of them is sort of looking at it from being part of the Red Cross Climate Center and having worked with like both development and humanitarian organizations. I think one of the challenges that we don't ask ourselves often enough is how do we make ourselves more scarce, right? And and I think part of I think the reason that I have an optimistic view of social protection is because I think it's the start of that, essentially because of what Terry was saying, because social protection has a history of becoming part of the social contract of a country and being transformational. And I think it's encouraging to see that, for instance, Terry was mentioning the adaptation gap of 500 billion, just sort of kind of like a very quick calculation. But we recently did also a very quick calculation of how much social protection spending there is on low and middle income countries, and it's about that. It's about 500 billion per year. So if we look at the spending of social protection programs in country and not ourselves, like the humanitarian and the development world, and the financing that is coming for climate adaptation and things like that, it's a different story, and I think that's encouraging. And then the second reflection, very quickly, which I would say, I agree with Terry that the sort of the rise of the welfare state in the Western world was very much driven by the labor unions and the workers. But there was also, especially in continental Europe after the Second World War, there was a willingness to have a much more redistributive and just system, I think. And there was also an agreement on like that as the way forward, as well as the push from the bottom, from democratic movements. And I wonder if climate change can be a little bit of that fire that you need to get people to agree on a different social contract. But looking at Matthias' data, it doesn't look so promising. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Dunya. Your thoughts? And Matthias, indeed, I'm coming to you next, Matthias.
I agree somewhat to kind of the dire picture situation where at a really critical spot in humanity, because we see the climate crisis is accelerating. We don't see nearly enough action, either mitigation or adaptation, to really tackle that. But I do still, I try to remain hopeful, because I think at the same time, we do see so much kind of pressure coming from below. We see people taking to the streets to demand more action. We do see a lot of kind of more local or subnational examples of interesting initiatives that aim to tackle those issues. So we do see, we have some in our report. I mean, the figure I showed was from our last flagship report. It's already 4 years old now, but where we try to identify kind of transformative social policy examples. And at the end of the day, most of them just aren't quite there yet. But we did identify a number of really interesting examples where governments tried to do things a bit differently. Or for example, in Uruguay, there was an attempt to offer social protection also to informal workers to really address the current issues. And I think we see a lot coming from movements from NGOs. I do agree with Terry. I think that in the past, those things have been driven by movements, and in a combination of like movements that actually enter into policy spaces at kind of window of opportunity type of moments. And I'm like, some of me is hoping that the window of opportunity for the whole post-COVID recovery discussion hasn't closed yet, because I think we are at this moment where a lot of demands can be made and more progressive demands can be made, also in contexts where we've historically seen an absolute like rejection of kind of social policies. Including the US, but also other contexts, you know, where people are now seeing the value of social policy. And I'm hoping that we can kind of take this forward and really question a little bit the broader systemic issues that we need to tackle if we are trying to work towards equality.
Really well said. Thank you a lot, Dunya. So many questions, so many questions. Matthias, I'm coming back to you, and given our time, this might be the last thing that people hear. Of course, stay on a little bit extra if you can. But Matthias, you know, you've provided us such a nice look at your analysis, what we see in the facts. Here are two questions. On the whole, do you think that social protection, like, is the situation getting better or worse? It's an incredibly huge question and a bit too broad. And the second, maybe for all of you, but we'll start with Matthias. We're now in the 21st century. Our system is clearly changing. Demography is different. Technology is different. Cultures, who knows? I just don't know that area. Climate change is different. That's something new that we didn't have in this degree or directionality in the 20th century. So our system's clearly changing, and Terry, you've really jogged our minds about that. So the question is, what would be the right questions to ask social protection to do in the 21st century? What are the problems of the 21st century that you think this tool, where you're all experts, could help humanity? Huge question, but let's start first with you, Matthias. Which direction are we going generally?
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Very challenging questions, Coco. I think we're, in my observation, we're getting better and worse at the same time. We're actually getting better in absolute terms. So countries are, and globally, I think we are improving in social protection. The question is the problem and the rise of the problem outpacing us? And I think Terry's chart, you know, with the boundaries, the guardrails, and how they change was actually very useful. So I think. If you look really into, I mean, let's say with the climate change issue and mixing it with demographic change and some other trends, if you really think for the needs for future social protection, then this is outpacing the slight improvements that we see, I would think. And that is, I think, troublesome. And I think that hasn't really clicked yet for everybody. Hence, I think looking into scenarios of the future, looking into also the magnitude of the challenge, changes in the future along SSP scenarios or something like that is very useful, I think, because that is not clear in the, not very prominent in the debate, not in the academic debate, not in the political debate, I would say. And what are then the questions? I think that is actually one of the questions. Do we actually know? Can we provide better information also how big the problem is still going to get, and then do an assessment of, you know, what does the change need to be at two levels? I think on the one hand side, it's very good to talk about the big, you know, transformations Terry is talking about, but it's not easy to bring about these changes, and not quickly anyway. And I wouldn't be so sure that past transformations have been that philanthropic exercise. If you really look into the welfare state that Terry mentioned, for example, really driven also in the German imperial system, it was a nation building exercise. So very different sets of goals behind it, actually, not so much the philanthropy in the background. Anyway, that's going to be difficult. And so I think that is one discourse we need to be having, but at the same time, what can be done within the current system if we are to accept realistically that the system might not change anytime soon? How can you spend the existing money that is around, for instance, in the most effective way and in the fairest way, for instance? That is, I think, then also where we still lack actually good advice from science, where we lack the political debate on social contract and so forth. We don't have it to the extent that we would need it, I think. So both levels are interesting. Normatively, I would be fully with you on the one level. Realistically, is that big transformation actually coming? Or should we not rather also get more our heads around what can be done within the existing framework, accepting that this is more than suboptimal? I think that's also an important question we need to ask, to be honest.
Yeah, great, Matthias. I don't have to go around to everybody in the circle, but please just hop in if you have thoughts that you'd like to add. You know, what are the problems of the 21st century that you think social protection can rise to the occasion? Or maybe we need to have a bit of a rethink about social protection for the 21st century, something like that. Reflections?
Yeah, maybe just a very brief one, also reflecting on what Matthias said. I think that we already have a lot of systems in place already, and the focus should not be to transform social protection from the bottom up, but actually also looking what we have in terms of cross-learning from other sectors. I mean, then also looking at adaptive social protection is, of course, combining different knowledge with backgrounds and also frameworks. If you look at mainstreaming, if you look at policy coherence, integrated risk governance, for example, I think that adaptive social protection can learn a lot from these already existing frameworks, but this just has to be transformed and actually translated then into social protection thinking also. I think this is crucial.
Yeah, thanks, Dom.
I'd add a comment that one of the problems is that we've shifted in the last 40 years from a situation where we could do independent, autonomous research into one where we're all institutionalized. We're all in our organizations. And we had a little joke yesterday when we did a rehearsal about whether we would have our logos of our organizations on our back screen. And everything is around this identity because it's around getting contracts and funding and so on. It's extremely difficult now to do independent autonomous research. And what that means is that much of what we do is channeled by what the funders want us to do. And also we then censor ourselves as to what we might say about the world and what we're looking at. So basically what we should be starting at is what are the problems in the world? And of those problems, to what extent is social protection part of the answer? Because a lot of what we've seen, and it came up in one of the questions, is a lot of these programs have no endpoint. There's a debate in India about whether NREGA should end. So do they go on? Do they just simply perpetuate the system? There's a very powerful argument in India that the NREGA simply perpetuates the system of cheap rural labor and enables the landlords to have what they want. So it's not really modifying the labor market, it's actually supporting the labor market for the benefit of those who are already powerful. So I think what I would say is that we have to act as if we were not part of an organization and not think through our organization and ask ourselves, how would we think it needed to be done differently if we were not speaking of and acting on behalf of our organization? Because I think that would open up a hell of a lot of free thinking rather than being representatives of our corporation.
That almost is Rawlsian, Terry, right? If
Sorry?
there was that almost is Rawlsian. I love that question. How would we act, or how would the rules look if there was a curtain between us and reality? I think others could say it more gracefully, but I love that. That's actually, you know, a question that any of you could have with your colleagues or other people just today. It's fantastic, Terry. Terry, could I ask you just to chat, like put that question in the chat as a little invitation for us all to, that's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Cecilia?
Yeah, I just wanted to, something that sparked in my head from Terry's comment, and I just want to say we've also been trying to do this. Actually, we had some dialogues this year about the role of social protection in climate change, and we invited people and we just said we don't want you to come here as an expert from such and such organization. We just want you to come here as an expert, as somebody that has a stake in the future, as a person, and I think that's a very interesting, it just opens up a whole different set of issues and conversations. But just on that, and to reflect on again on the sort of the role of humanitarian agencies and development agencies, and your question about the 21st century, I think social protection has been put in the agenda, especially in Africa and Asia, not so much in Latin America, which already existed before, but it's been put in the agenda by us, by the international actors, right? And I think what I would like to see in the 21st century to rise to the challenges of the 21st century is for those systems that already exist, for that sort of seed that is already there, to be taken up by countries, if as part of their own cultural and social context and contract. And I think I'm not sure what we can do about that, but I think that's something that we should keep in mind in the back of our heads when we do this work.
Wonderful. And Dunya, I give you the very last word. And after Dunya, I would like to wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day, however long you're going to be awake today. It's been really great. And I hope that, like I said to some of you earlier, I hope this is a continuation of a really important question. Thanks for joining us. And Dunya, last word to you.
Thank you, Coco. There's so much responsibility. I think essentially, I do just want to say, I believe that social protection will play a very essential role in the 21st century. I don't think I'll give an answer to exactly how that will look like, but I do want to also second Terry and Cecilia and their kind of call for really building kind of creative coalitions and kind of content coalitions and trying to work together, overcoming the fragmentation that is also perpetuated within the international system and all the different kind of researchers, institutes and donors, etc. And as a practical suggestion, maybe we should also kind of really directly talk to the folks in ILO that are leading the social protection work there, and just kind of broaden out and build coalitions around the world to push for change.
Well said. Thank you so much. Well, today we've joined Matthias and others in the Summer Academy hosted by United Nations University and in partnership and supported by Munich Re Foundation, the UNFCCC, LMU in Munich, your place, Matthias. We've been talking about future trends in social protection. And it looks like, Dunya, if you're right, it looks like the next chapter is to be written, and hopefully all of us gathered here today can play a role in that. Thank you, everybody. Himanshu, over to you, and wishing you all a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. See you.